Welcome to The Debate. We are diving into the intellectual architecture of Paul's letter to the Romans today. And specifically, we're grappling with what is, well, arguably the text's most profound scholarly tension.
Right. The central question, as I see it, is how does Paul coherently hold together that declaration, that a person is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law, back in chapter 3, with his earlier affirmation that God will render to each one according to his deeds in chapter 2?
Exactly. And I'll be arguing that faith is really the exclusive basis for righteousness, both initially and, I think, finally.
Whereas I'll be maintaining that ethical obedience remains a necessary and, frankly, integrated component for that ultimate vindication Paul talks about.
Okay, so for me, the core argument rests on the revelation of God's righteousness from faith to faith, as Paul outlines it in Romans 1:17. He uses this very specific, almost legal language to define justification. It's framed as a judicial act, a free gift received by belief alone, completely independent of, human merit. And if we look at Abraham in chapter 4, right, he was declared righteous or justified solely because of his belief. Romans 4, verse 3. And crucially, this happened before he was circumcised, as Paul points out in 4.10. So this really establishes for Paul that by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified. And in my view, deeds of the law, well, it encompasses all human moral and ritual effort. Faith is the exclusive way in.
Okay. I see why you prioritize that distinction. I really do. But I come at it from a slightly different angle, maybe emphasizing the holistic context of God's judgment, which Paul actually introduces right away in chapter 2. Paul is explicit there that God's judgment is according to truth against those who transgress.
Right.
And furthermore, he explicitly states in Romans 2:7 that God promises eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory. Now that sounds an awful lot like a judgment based on sustained ethical behavior, doesn't it?
Right.
In fact, he even affirms that the doers of the law will be justified in 2:13. So the justification by faith in chapter 3 must therefore be interpreted not as somehow canceling out these ethical requirements, but perhaps as initiating a life where those requirements can actually be met.
Okay, but if we grant your point there, that ethical obedience is somehow required for the final judgment, how is grace truly, free? How is justification genuinely apart from works? If Paul were only attacking specific covenant markers, like circumcision and Jewish identity stuff, when he talks about the deeds of the law, then the entire structure of the first 3 chapters, establishing the universality of sin for everyone, Gentiles included, it just doesn't make as much sense. The deep tension Paul is resolving, I think, is between human effort, any kind of works, and divine grace received through faith. Romans 3:23 is the pivot. All have sinned and fall short. That charge feels too universal to be aimed merely at, say, ritual failures.
That's a compelling point about the universality of sin, I grant you that. But have you considered that Paul simultaneously establishes the abiding moral expectation of the law, even for Gentiles? I mean, he points out that Gentiles who lack the written law still by nature do the things in the law. He says they show the work of the law written in their hearts. That's Romans 2:14-15. This suggests the core ethical standard is non-negotiable, and it sort of precedes that distinction between ritual and morality you were making. I'm not suggesting justification is earned, let me be clear, but maybe that the initial judicial declaration is somehow validated by the life that follows. And later, Paul affirms that love is the fulfillment of the law, Romans 13:10, indicating the moral law's function continues, fulfilled now by, the internal transformation of the Spirit, as he lays out in Romans 8:4.
And this leads directly, I think, to how faith relates to that continuing standard. Paul actually anticipates this exact kind of counter-argument, doesn't he? He asks, do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. That's Romans 3:31. And how do we establish it? Well, by showing its true purpose, which Paul says is to reveal sin, like in Romans 7:7, and then providing the mechanism through the Spirit for the fulfillment of its righteous requirement. This means living a life under grace, not law, as Romans 6:14 says. So the legal verdict, the justification, it's complete, it's freely given. The resulting life of obedience flows from that freedom. It's not a means to achieve the verdict itself.
See, I'm not quite convinced by that line of reasoning, because if faith establishes the law, as you just quoted, then the resulting works of righteousness seem to become more than just a, let's say, casual outcome. They feel like indispensable evidence, maybe the necessary fruit that links that initial justified status back to the required final reckoning he mentioned earlier. Paul tells believers explicitly to become slaves of righteousness for holiness, that's Romans 6:19, and to put to death the deeds of the body by the Spirit in Romans 8:13. These imperatives, these commands, are what hold the judicial declaration of chapter 3 in, I think, necessary tension with the future accountability of chapter 2.
So, look, we have established, I believe, that Paul prioritizes faith as the initiating, the justifying factor. It makes one righteous freely by grace. The subsequent ethical life, the patient continuance in doing good you mentioned, it flows from this justified status. It demonstrates the Spirit's power, rather than serving as some kind of precondition or even co-condition for the divine verdict.
I still find that distinction between precondition and evidence to be perhaps too sharp, especially when we're discussing the comprehensive scope of God's judgment as Paul lays it out. He seems to carefully weave this theological tapestry, ensuring God's righteous judgment always involves a response to the entirety of the human life lived. The profound complexity of Romans, I think, lies precisely in integrating God's unmerited mercy, especially in those early chapters, with the absolute requirement for subsequent holiness and obedience outlined later on. There is clearly much more to explore in this text.